28 teenagers disappeared without a trace on what should have been the best day of their lives. For 20 years their families searched. For 20 years they hoped. But what a trail runner found hidden deep in Washington's Olympic National Forest would shatter everything they thought they knew about that June day in 2002. Dana Ellis had been running these trails for 15 years. The morning of June 15th, 2022, started like any other, her usual 5 a.m. start. The familiar crunch of pine needles under her feet, the rhythmic sound of her breathing cutting through the forest silence. But something caught her eye that morning. A glint of metal where metal shouldn't be, pushing through layers of ferns and fallen logs that had accumulated over 2 decades. Dana's heart began to race, and not from the run. What emerged from the undergrowth was the skeletal remains of a white passenger van, its paint chipped and faded, tires completely deflated into the earth. The license plate was barely legible, but the numbers and letters that remained would soon send shockwaves through a community that had never stopped grieving. Inside the van, Dana discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Faded maps scattered across decaying seats, crumpled snack wrappers from brands that hadn't existed in years, a graduation tassel hanging from the rearview mirror, its gold color now a sickly brown, and in the back scattered bones, partial skeletons tangled in tattered clothing, arranged in ways that defied explanation. But here's what made this discovery truly terrifying. There were no roads leading to this location, no signs of a crash. The van had been deliberately hidden, concealed by someone who wanted it to stay lost forever. Among the relics inside were items arranged in peculiar patterns, like symbols begging to be deciphered. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a wrong turn gone fatal. This was something far more sinister. As Dana dialed 911 with trembling fingers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The forest that had been her sanctuary for years suddenly felt alive with malevolent presence. What she had stumbled upon wasn't just evidence of a tragedy. It was proof of a calculated act of evil that had been festering in the wilderness for 2 decades. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, you have to understand who these kids were. The Lakewood High School class of 2002 wasn't just any graduating class. They were the golden generation, the kids who had survived Columbine's shadow, who had rallied together through personal tragedies, and who seemed destined for greatness. At the center of it all was Mia Reynolds, the kind of student who made parents wish their own children were more like her. Soccer team captain, homecoming queen, bound for Stanford University on a full academic scholarship. Her smile could light up a room, but those closest to her knew about the immense pressure she carried. Her mother, Judge Patricia Reynolds, had raised Mia alone after her father's death in a car accident when she was 12. The expectation wasn't just to succeed, it was to be perfect. Then there was Alex Kim, the class documentary filmmaker who never went anywhere without his camcorder. He had this infectious enthusiasm about capturing their final moments together. This trip's gonna be legendary, he would tell anyone who would listen, his eyes sparkling with the kind of excitement that only comes from being 18 and believing the whole world is waiting for you. Alex dreamed of film school, of turning their ordinary teenage experiences into something extraordinary. Jordan Hayes carried the weight of athletic expectations on his broad shoulders. As the star quarterback, everyone assumed his path was clear, follow his father's footsteps to the NFL. But those close to Jordan knew he struggled with living up to a legacy he never wanted. The quiet intensity that made him a great leader on the field masked deep insecurities about his own identity. And then there was Sofia Vargas, the artistic soul who always sat slightly apart from the others, sketching in her worn notebook. Her portraits of classmates were intertwined with surreal forest visions that she claimed came from her dreams. Sophia was the outsider who somehow fit perfectly, speaking rarely but always profoundly. Her art teacher often said she had a gift for seeing things others couldn't. These weren't just statistics or names on a missing person report. These were young people with dreams, fears, complicated family dynamics, and an unbreakable bond forged through 4 years of shared experiences. They had weathered the loss of their beloved English teacher, Mr. Peterson, to cancel their junior year. They had celebrated together when their debate team won the state championship. They were planning futures that would take them across the country, but promising to stay in touch forever. The final bell on their last day of high school rang on a sunny Friday in May 2002. Lincoln Parks in the end blared from someone's radio as they exchanged permission slips and chattered about their upcoming adventure to the remote Quinault rainforest. Isolated beaches, towering evergreens, no cell phone service. It sounded like paradise to a group of teenagers desperate for one last taste of freedom before adult responsibilities took over. But as they hugged their parents goodbye and piled into that white van, none of them could have imagined that their adventure would become a 20-year nightmare that would haunt an entire community. Freedom was about to become a trap, and their dreams were about to turn into something far darker than any of them could have conceived. June 1st, 2002, dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect Pacific Northwest morning that makes you believe anything is possible. 28 graduating seniors from Lakewood High School had spent months planning this trip, scraping together money from part-time jobs and fundraisers. After grueling final exams and the stress of college applications, this was their reward. One last hurrah before scatter across the country to begin their adult lives. The white 15-passenger van they had rented was packed with sleeping bags, camping gear, and enough snacks to feed a small army. Behind the wheel was Mr. Elias Thorne, a substitute driver who had stepped in at the last minute when their regular transportation fell through. None of the students knew much about Thorne. He was a quiet man in his 50s who had recently moved to the area and worked as a substitute teacher. He seemed competent enough, and frankly, the kids were too excited to pay much attention to who was driving. The send-off from the school parking lot was joyous chaos. Parents snapped photos, final hugs were exchanged, and promises of safe returns echoed across the asphalt. Grainy home videos captured the laughter. The group posed with peace signs and silly faces. Alex Kim's camera rolled constantly, documenting what he was sure would be the opening scenes of an epic coming-of-age story. Made it to the edge of the woods. Adventure starts now. The text message came from Kayla Martinez's phone at 6:47 p.m. It was the last communication anyone would receive from any member of the group. When the van didn't arrive at the designated campground that evening, initial concern was dismissed as typical teenage time management. Cell phone coverage was notoriously spotty in the Olympic National Forest, and the winding mountain roads were known to slow down travel times. Parents convinced themselves that the group had simply stopped for dinner or gotten a late start. But as night fell and the thick fog that was common to the region rolled in, worry began to gnaw at the families waiting by their phones. By midnight, when there was still no word, the first calls to park rangers were made. By dawn, alarm bells were ringing throughout the community. The search that began on June 2nd was massive and immediate. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors cutting through the morning mist. Canine units followed scent trails that led nowhere. Volunteers combed through miles of dense forest, calling out names that echoed back unanswered. The campground ranger confirmed what everyone feared: the group had never arrived at their destination. It was as if 28 teenagers and 2 adults had simply evaporated into thin air. No skid marks on the dangerous mountain curves. No reports of accidents from other drivers. No van broken down on the side of any road. They had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. 3 days into the search, a hiker found a discarded backpack near a remote trailhead. The bag was empty, its zipper deliberately torn, as if someone had quickly removed its contents. The backpack belonged to Marcus Webb, a quiet kid who loved astronomy and had been planning to study astrophysics at MIT. Then came the postcard that changed everything. It arrived at the Martinez family home exactly 1 week after the disappearance, bearing no postmark or stamp. The message was simple and chilling: "We're okay. Don't worry." Handwriting analysis suggested it might have been written by Liam Foster, but something was off. The letters were shaky, uncertain, as if written under duress or by someone attempting to forge his handwriting. As days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, theories multiplied like wildfire through the community. Had the group run away together? Had they been abducted? Some whispered about supernatural explanations. The Olympic National Forest was known for its indigenous legends about spirits that led people astray. But rational minds focused on more earthly possibilities, none of them good. After 6 months of intensive searching, the case was officially classified as a mass disappearance. The van, the people, and any trace of what had happened to them remained as elusive as shadows in the deep forest. But families refused to give up hope, organizing annual vigils and hiring private investigators with their life savings. Judge Patricia Reynolds became a vocal advocate for missing persons cases, channeling her grief into action, while privately scanning every crowd for a glimpse of her daughter's face. The mystery of what happened on June 1st, 2002, became the ghost story that haunted Lakewood. And for 20 years, the forest kept its secrets buried beneath layers of fallen leaves and growing silence. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain, but it never truly heals the wound left by unanswered questions. For 20 years, the families of the missing class of 2002 lived in a purgatory of not knowing, unable to grieve properly, because there was always the possibility that their children might walk through the door, but unable to hope fully because logic suggested the worst. Lakewood High School created a memorial wall in the main hallway, 28 photos of Forever 18 faces smiling out at new generations of students. Every year on June 1st, the community gathered for a candlelight vigil in the school's gymnasium. Former teachers would speak about the bright futures that had been stolen. Parents would share memories that grew more precious with each passing year. Judge Patricia Reynolds threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried her friends. She funded missing persons initiatives, advocated for better communication systems in remote areas, and personally reviewed every cold case that crossed her desk. But late at night, in the privacy of her home, she would sit in Mia's unchanged bedroom and whisper to the silence, "I can feel you out there, baby. I know you're alive." Alex Kim's parents kept his camcorder charged and ready, occasionally playing back the footage he had shot in the weeks leading up to the trip. His infectious laughter and boundless optimism flickered across the small screen, a ghost of joy that made their empty house feel even more hollow. Jordan Hayes' father stopped attending NFL games altogether. The sport that had once been his passion became a painful reminder of conversations he would never have with his son about draft prospects and college recruitment. The trophies in Jordan's room gathered dust, monuments to a future that would never come. Some families couldn't bear the weight of not knowing. The Martinezes divorced 2 years after Kayla's disappearance, each parent blaming the other for allowing her to go on the trip. The Webbs moved across the country, unable to stay in a town where every corner held memories of Marcus's quiet presence. But others held on with a determination that bordered on obsession. They formed support groups that met monthly, sharing any new tip or theory. They hired private investigators who promised fresh perspectives on old evidence. They created online forums where amateur detectives dissected every detail of the case, generating thousands of theories but no concrete answers. The most persistent investigator was Detective Ray Morrison, who had been assigned to the case as a young officer and never let it go. Even after his retirement, Morrison kept detailed files in his garage, walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. He interviewed and re-interviewed everyone connected to the case, hoping that someone's memory might unlock the mystery. "Something about this case has never sat right with me," Morrison would tell anyone who would listen. 28 kids don't just vanish without a trace. Someone knows something. Someone always knows something. Strange reports trickled in over the years. Hikers claimed to hear voices echoing through the forest on quiet nights. Campers reported seeing lights moving through the trees in areas where no trails existed. A few witnesses swore they had seen groups of people in robes walking single file through remote sections of the national forest. But these sightings were always dismissed as misidentified park rangers or religious groups on retreat. The community had learned to live with the mystery. The way you learn to live with chronic pain. It was always there. A dull ache that flared up during anniversaries and holidays. Parents aged 20 years in the span of 2 decades. Their hair turning gray with worry. Their eyes carrying a sadness that no amount of time could erase. And then on June 15th, 2022, everything changed. Dana Ellis's discovery in the depths of Olympic National Forest didn't just uncover a rusted van. It ripped open wounds that had barely begun to scab over. The bones scattered in the back of the vehicle told a story of violence and deliberate concealment. The items arranged in strange patterns suggested ritual and purpose. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that someone had known where these remains were for 20 years and had chosen to let the families suffer in ignorance. The van's discovery was like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples spread quickly through the community, bringing both horrible clarity and devastating new questions. If these were the remains of the missing students, what had happened to the others? Why were some bones missing? And who had orchestrated not just their disappearance, but their carefully concealed burial in the deep woods? The answers would come from the most unexpected source imaginable, one of their own, walking out of the shadows after 2 decades of silence. The call came into the Lakewood Police Department at 3:47 p.m. on June 28, 2022. The desk sergeant almost dismissed it as another crank call. They had received dozens since news of the van's discovery had broken. But something in the woman's voice made him pause. She sounded terrified, but also determined. "I need to speak to someone about the class of 2002. She said, her words barely above a whisper. "I was there. I survived." When the woman arrived at the station an hour later, she looked like she had stepped out of a nightmare. Her clothes were threadbare and ill-fitting, as if she had been living rough for years. Her hair was stringy and unkempt, streaked with premature gray. But it was her eyes that stopped everyone in their tracks, hollow, haunted, constantly darting to the shadows, as if expecting something terrible to emerge. "I'm Mia Reynolds," she said, her voice shaking. "From the class of 2002. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. They had seen their share of false confessions and attention seekers over the years. But when they ran her fingerprints, when they compared her DNA to samples taken from Mia's childhood bedroom, the impossible became undeniable. This was indeed Mia Reynolds, aged 20 years beyond her 18-year-old self, bearing the weight of experiences that had carved deep lines into her face. Judge Patricia Reynolds received the call at her office and nearly collapsed. For 20 years, she had dreamed of this moment, but the reality was far different from her fantasies. The daughter who walked into the police station wasn't the bright, confident girl who had left for a camping trip 2 decades earlier. This was someone who had been broken and rebuilt, someone who flinched at sudden movements and spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone who had learned that words could be dangerous. "I wasn't supposed to escape," Mia whispered during her first interview, her eyes never meeting those of the detective across from her. "They're still out there, they're watching, they know I'm here." The questions came rapid fire. Where had she been? What happened to the others? Who was they? But Mia would only shake her head, glancing repeatedly at the windows, as if expecting faces to appear in the glass. "It's not safe," she would repeat. "They'll come for me. They always said they would come for anyone who tried to leave." Before investigators could get more information, Mia bolted from the interview room, slipping past officers who were too stunned to react quickly enough. She disappeared into the streets of Lakewood like a ghost, returning to the shadows. The news of Mia Reynolds' return spread through the community like wildfire. Some families were filled with hope. If Mia had survived, perhaps their children had too. Others were angry, demanding to know why she had stayed hidden while they suffered. The questions that swirled around her were almost as numerous as those surrounding the original disappearance. Detective Morrison, now 73 and officially retired, came out of his garage office to assist with the investigation. "In 30 years of police work," he told reporters, "I've never seen anything like this." A survivor returning after 20 years of silence. "There's more to this story than we could have ever imagined." The search for Mia became as intensive as the original search for the missing class had been. but she had learned well how to disappear, how to move through a world without leaving traces. For 3 days, she remained a ghost haunting the edges of her hometown. When they finally found her, she was sitting in the old cemetery where her father was buried, staring at his headstone as if seeking answers from the dead. She didn't resist when officers approached. Instead, she looked up with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated pain and said, "I'm ready to tell you what happened, but you're not going to believe me." What Mia Reynolds would reveal in the coming days would shatter everything law enforcement thought they knew about missing persons cases. Her story would expose a web of deception, manipulation, and horror that had been operating in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest for decades. But most importantly, her testimony would reveal that the disappearance of the class of 2002 wasn't a random tragedy. It was a carefully orchestrated recruitment by a group that had been watching them for months. The truth, as Mia was about to reveal, was far more terrifying than any theory the investigators had developed over 2 decades of speculation. And her survival hadn't been luck. It had been the result of 20 years of planning, waiting, and gathering the courage to expose the people who had stolen her youth and murdered her friends. The safe house where Mia Reynolds finally told her story was a small, windowless room in a nondescript building outside of town. Detective Morrison sat across from her, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to hear. A recording device hummed quietly between them, capturing every word of a testimony that would rewrite the official record of one of Washington State's most notorious cold cases. It started when the van broke down. Mia began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were maybe 3 hours into the forest when the engine just died." Mr. Thorne got out to look under the hood, but he didn't seem surprised. Looking back now, I think he knew it was going to happen. She paused, her fingers tracing nervous patterns on the table. "We were scared but not panicked. You know, we were 18, immortal, convinced that every problem had a solution." Alex was already joking about how this would make great footage for his documentary. Sophia was sketching the broken-down van. "We had no idea we were walking into a trap that had been set months in advance." According to Mia, they hadn't been stranded long before help arrived, but not the kind of help they were expecting. 3 men emerged from the forest, dressed in simple work clothes, carrying basic tools. They introduced themselves as members of a religious community that lived off-grid in the deeper parts of the national forest. They called themselves the Awakened. Mia continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. They said they had lived in harmony with nature for years, completely self-sufficient. They offered to help fix our van, but said it would take a few days to get the right parts. In the meantime, they invited us to stay at their community. The students debated among themselves. Some wanted to walk back to the main road and get help from park rangers. Others were intrigued by the idea of seeing how people lived completely off the grid. In the end, curiosity won out, and Thorne encouraged them to accept the invitation. That first night in their compound was like something out of a fairy tale. Mia remembered. They had beautiful log cabins, gardens that seemed to produce everything they needed, and this sense of peace that we had never experienced. They fed us amazing food, told stories around a fire, and talked about how the outside world was poisoning itself with technology and greed. But paradise has a way of revealing its true nature slowly. Over the following days, subtle changes began to occur. The community's leaders, a man and woman who called themselves Brother Marcus and Sister Elena, began holding private conversations with individual students. They spoke about the corrupted nature of modern society, the emptiness of materialistic pursuits, and the spiritual enlightenment that came from rejecting the outside world. They were incredibly sophisticated in their manipulation. Mia explained. They didn't try to convert all of us at once. They identified the kids who were struggling, Jordan with his family pressure, Alex with his insecurities about his future, Sophia with her feeling of being an outsider. They made each of us feel like they understood us better than anyone ever had. The community also introduced evening rituals meditation sessions, where herbal teas were served to help achieve deeper spiritual states. The teas, Mia would later understand, contained mild psychoactive compounds that made the students more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of critical thinking. By the end of the first week, half the class was talking about staying longer. Mia admitted, "They made us believe that we had found something special, something that the rest of the world would never understand. They convinced us that our families wouldn't support our spiritual growth, that college and careers were just chains that would prevent us from achieving true enlightenment." But not everyone was convinced. A group of students, led by Marcus Webb and Kayla Martinez, began questioning why their van still wasn't fixed, why they weren't allowed to contact their families, and why some of the community members seemed to be watching them constantly. "That's when we discovered the truth about Mr. Thorne," Mia said, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "His real name was David Caldwell, and he wasn't just a substitute driver. He was Brother Marcus's brother, planted at our school specifically to gain access to our class. They had been watching us for months, studying our personalities, our family situations, identifying which of us would be most vulnerable to their recruitment techniques." The students who began asking questions started disappearing from the communal activities. They would be taken for private counseling sessions that lasted hours. Some would return seeming dazed and compliant. Others wouldn't return at all. "I realized something was terribly wrong when Sophia showed me her sketchbook," Mia continued. She had been drawing the same images over and over: hooded figures around fires, symbols that she said came to her in dreams, scenes of violence that she couldn't explain. But these weren't dreams. They were suppressed memories of things she had witnessed during her counseling sessions. The breaking point came when Mia discovered what the community called their purification chamber, a hidden underground room where students who resisted indoctrination were subjected to psychological torture, designed to break down their sense of individual identity. Some emerged as completely compliant followers. Others, Mia learned with horror, never emerged at all. "I tried to organize an escape," she said, tears streaming down her face for the first time during the interview. "But they knew, they always knew. They had been monitoring everything we said and did. The night we planned to run, they were waiting for us." What happened next would haunt Mia for the rest of her life, and explain why it took her 20 years to find the courage to speak the truth about the fate of her classmates. The escape attempt was scheduled for 2 a.m. on a moonless night in late June 2002. 14 students had secretly agreed to participate, coordinating through whispered conversations and hand signals to avoid detection by the community members, who seemed to be constantly watching. Mia Reynolds had emerged as the group's leader, using the organizational skills that had made her student body president to plan their flight from what they now recognized as captivity. "We thought we were so smart," Mia said, her voice hollow with 20 years of regret. "We had studied the patrol patterns, identified the gaps in their surveillance, even found what we thought was an unmapped trail that would lead us back to the main road. But they knew, they had always known." As the students crept from their assigned cabins in the pre-dawn darkness, they walked directly into a trap that had been designed specifically for this moment. The Awakened had been expecting an escape attempt. They had even encouraged it, Mia would later realize, as a way to identify which members of the class would never truly submit to their indoctrination. "The lights came on all at once," Mia remembered, her hands shaking as she spoke. "Dozens of community members surrounded us, holding those battery-powered lanterns. Brother Marcus was standing in the center of them, smiling like a proud father whose children had just learned an important lesson." What followed was a systematic psychological dismantling, designed to crush any remaining resistance. The 14 students were separated into individual isolation chambers, underground rooms that had been carved out of the hillside decades earlier. For 3 days, they were deprived of food and sleep, while community members took turns delivering ideological lectures through speakers mounted in the walls. "They wanted us to understand that the outside world was gone for us," Mia explained. "Our families had been told we were dead. Our futures had been erased. The only life available to us now was as members of the Awakened. We could choose to embrace that life willingly, or they would help us embrace it through more intensive methods." Some of the students broke within hours. The psychological pressure, combined with weeks of subtle drugging and isolation from anything familiar, had weakened their ability to maintain their sense of individual identity. They emerged from the chambers willing to participate in community activities, to recruit new members, and to accept that their previous lives had been meaningless. But others, including Mia, Marcus Webb, and Jordan Hayes, refused to surrender. For them, the awakened had developed more extreme methods of persuasion. They called it ego death, Mia said, her voice barely audible. They would take us to a chamber deeper underground where they had painted symbols on every surface, the same symbols Sophia had been drawing in her sketchbook. They would give us massive doses of hallucinogenic drugs, and then subject us to hours of sensory bombardment, designed to completely shatter our sense of self. The goal was to reduce the resistant students to a blank slate that could be rebuilt according to the community's specifications. Some subjects emerged from these sessions as hollow shells, capable of following instructions, but lacking any independent thought or emotion. Others suffered complete psychological breaks and had to be permanently restrained in hidden sections of the compound. Marcus couldn't handle it, Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. The third session broke something fundamental in him. He would just sit and stare at the wall for hours, occasionally laughing at things no one else could see. Jordan tried to take care of him, but Jordan was fighting his own battle with what they were doing to his mind. The community's treatment of resistant subjects revealed the true nature of their operation. This wasn't just a religious cult seeking converts. It was a systematic program of psychological experimentation designed to develop techniques for completely controlling human behavior. The students weren't just victims. They were test subjects in a decades-long research project. I learned later that we weren't their first group, Mia revealed. They had been perfecting their techniques on smaller numbers of people for years. Hitchhikers who wouldn't be missed, runaways fleeing troubled homes. But our class represented their first attempt to process a large group of subjects simultaneously. The awakened documented everything meticulously. They kept detailed records of which techniques were most effective on different personality types, which drugs produced the most useful psychological states, and which subjects showed the greatest potential for complete transformation. The students had become unwilling participants in a research program that would have horrified professional psychologists. By winter of 2002, I think only about half of us were still ourselves, Mia said. Others had either been successfully converted or had been damaged beyond repair. Those of us who remained knew that we were living on borrowed time. Eventually, they would either break us completely or decide that we were too dangerous to keep alive. It was during this desperate period that Mia began planning not just her own escape, but her survival in a world where the awakened would never stop looking for her. She would need to disappear so completely that even the most sophisticated tracking methods would fail to locate her, and she would need to gather evidence that could eventually be used to expose the community and prevent them from claiming more victims. What she discovered during her months of careful observation would provide law enforcement with the information they needed to unravel a conspiracy that extended far beyond one isolated religious community in the Olympic National Forest. Mia's escape from the awakened in March 2005 wasn't a desperate flight through the forest. It was the culmination of months of careful planning and intelligence gathering. Understanding that she would only get one chance, she had spent the winter documenting the community's operations, memorizing names and faces, and secretly collecting physical evidence that could corroborate her eventual testimony. I knew that if I survived, no one would believe my story without proof, Mia explained to Detective Morrison, a young woman claiming that a religious cult had kidnapped and brainwashed her high school class. Even I wouldn't have believed it without hard evidence. The evidence Mia had collected was damning. She had memorized the layout of the underground facilities, including chambers that contained equipment for psychological experimentation that would have been sophisticated even by university standards. She had observed meetings where community leaders discussed expanding their recruitment operations to other schools in the region. Most importantly, she had witnessed the final fate of classmates who had been deemed unsuitable for conversion. They called it returning to the earth, Mia said, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was describing. Students who couldn't be broken psychologically were sedated and then disposed of. They believed that by burying them in sacred ground within the forest, they were giving them a form of spiritual release they couldn't achieve in life. The scattered bones found in the van were only part of the story. According to Mia, the awakened had established multiple burial sites throughout their territory, each one carefully concealed and marked with symbols that held meaning only to community members. The van itself had been used as a mobile processing center during the early weeks of the students' captivity, moved deep into the forest, and abandoned when it was no longer needed. Brother Marcus believed that the bones of the converted dead held spiritual power. Mia explained. They would arrange them in patterns during ritual ceremonies, believing that this helped channel the energy needed for successful indoctrination of new subjects. That's why the remains were positioned the way your people found them, not as a burial, but as a spiritual tool. The information Mia provided allowed law enforcement to begin mapping the full scope of the Awaken's operations. The community hadn't simply been living off-grid. They had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that combined human trafficking, psychological experimentation, and systematic murder over a period of decades. We discovered that the community had connections to similar groups throughout the Pacific Northwest. Detective Morrison later told reporters they were part of a loose network of extremist organizations that shared information about recruitment techniques and target identification. What happened to the class of 2002 was just one operation in a much larger pattern of organized predation. The investigation that followed Mia's testimony was the largest joint law enforcement operation in Washington state history. Multiple agencies coordinated raids on locations throughout the Olympic Peninsula, uncovering evidence of crimes that stretched back to the 1980s. The underground chambers Mia had described were exactly where she said they would be, containing equipment and documentation that confirmed every detail of her account. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the realization that several community members had been living normal lives in nearby towns for years, serving as recruiters and intelligence gatherers. David Caldwell, the man who had posed as substitute driver Elias Thorne, had been systematically infiltrating schools throughout the region, identifying vulnerable students, and reporting back to community leaders about potential targets. They had files on hundreds of teenagers, Morrison revealed, detailed psychological profiles, family situations, academic records, everything they needed to identify kids who might be susceptible to recruitment or who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. The raids resulted in the arrest of 43 individuals, including the community's leadership and their network of outside collaborators. The evidence recovered filled multiple warehouses, documents, recordings, photographs, and physical remains that painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that had operated undetected for decades. What Mia Reynolds did by coming forward required a level of courage that most people can't comprehend. Morrison said she had spent 20 years knowing that these people were still out there, still taking victims, but she also knew that exposing them would make her a target for the rest of her life. Her testimony didn't just solve one case, it prevented dozens of future crimes. The psychological evaluation that Mia underwent as part of the investigation confirmed the authenticity of her account while also revealing the extraordinary mental resilience that had allowed her to survive 2 decades of hiding. She had created multiple false identities, moved constantly across the country, and developed an elaborate system for avoiding detection, while secretly gathering intelligence about the Awaken's continued activities. She never stopped being a victim, the forensic psychologist noted in his report, but she also never stopped being a fighter. Her decision to remain hidden wasn't cowardice. It was a strategic choice to ensure that when she finally spoke out, She could provide law enforcement with everything they needed to completely dismantle the organization that had destroyed her life. The trials that followed were among the most complex and emotionally charged proceedings in Washington state legal history. Judge Patricia Reynolds recused herself from all related cases, but she sat in the gallery every day, watching as the people who had murdered her daughter's classmates faced justice. David Caldwell, the man who had posed as their trusted driver, was the first to be convicted. Evidence showed that he had been specifically assigned to infiltrate Lakewood High School months before the graduation trip, building trust with administrators and students, while identifying potential targets for recruitment. His conviction on charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder carried a sentence of life without parole. Brother Marcus and sister Elena, whose real names were revealed to be Robert and Jennifer Hastings, had been running the Awakened for over 20 years. Their psychological experimentation on unwilling subjects had resulted in the deaths of dozens of people, including 17 members of the class of 2002. They were convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The systematic nature of these crimes represents one of the most heinous examples of organized predation in our state's history. The presiding judge said during sentencing, the defendants used sophisticated psychological manipulation to prey upon young people at one of the most vulnerable moments in their lives, the transition from childhood to adulthood. But justice in the courtroom couldn't heal the wounds that had festered in families and communities for 20 years. The parents who had spent 2 decades wondering if their children were alive now faced the devastating confirmation that their loved ones had died, in circumstances more horrific than they had ever imagined. Some families found a measure of peace in finally knowing the truth. Marcus Webb's parents were able to hold a proper funeral, finally laying their son to rest after 20 years of not knowing. Jordan Hayes' father returned to watching football games, honoring his son's memory by celebrating the sport they had both loved. Others struggled with the revelation that their children's deaths could have been prevented if Mia had spoken out sooner. The rational part of their minds understood that she had been a traumatized teenager trying to survive. But grief and anger don't always respond to reason. Mia herself faced the complex challenge of rebuilding a life that had been suspended in survival mode for 2 decades. The counseling process was long and difficult, complicated by the need to maintain security protocols even after the arrests. Some members of the Awakened had escaped the raids and remained at large, and law enforcement couldn't guarantee that she wouldn't face retaliation for her testimony. I spent 20 years preparing to tell this story, Mia said during her final interview with Detective Morrison. But I never prepared for what would happen afterward. How do you start living normally when you've forgotten what normal feels like? The community of Lakewood also had to grapple with the reality that their beloved missing students hadn't simply met with a tragic accident. They had been deliberately targeted and systematically murdered by people who had studied them like specimens in a laboratory. The randomness of tragedy is somehow easier to bear than the calculated nature of evil. The hardest part isn't that they're gone, Judge Patricia Reynolds said at the memorial service that was held after the trials concluded. The hardest part is knowing that their deaths were preventable. These weren't victims of fate or bad luck. They were murdered by people who chose to see them as objects instead of human beings with hopes and dreams and families who loved them. The story of the class of 2002 became a case study in law enforcement academies across the country, teaching future investigators about the sophisticated methods that predatory organizations use to identify and isolate victims. The psychological techniques that had been perfected by the Awakened were disturbingly similar to those used by other cults and trafficking organizations around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story is the reminder that evil rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs. It comes disguised as help, as understanding, as the promise of something better than what you currently have. The bright, capable students of Lakewood High's class of 2002 weren't naive or foolish. They were teenagers who made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time and paid for it with their lives. Mia Reynolds continues to work with law enforcement agencies, helping to identify potential cult recruitment activities and providing insight into the psychological manipulation techniques that allowed the Awakened to operate undetected for decades. Her survival wasn't just a personal victory. It was the key that unlocked justice for 27 other families and prevented countless future victims from suffering the same fate. "I can't give back what was taken from the other families," she said, "but I can make sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else." That's what Alex and Jordan and Sophia and all the others would have wanted for their deaths to mean something, to protect other kids from experiencing what we went through. The forest that once held 20 years of terrible secrets now stands as a reminder that truth has a way of emerging, even when it's buried beneath decades of silence and fear. The class of 2002 may have disappeared on what should have been the best day of their lives, but their story ultimately became a testament to the power of one survivor's courage to ensure that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. Do you think the kind of justice measure didn't suit the offense? Drop your comments, like the video, share, and do not forget to subscribe for more true crime stories.